the first thing to talk about really is how can we decide if a recovery protocol is effective? And some things might come to mind for you already. Now, there are really four main topics that I want to cover in this section. They're going to be that of blood lactate or lactic acid and hydrogen ions, acidity, delayed onset muscle soreness. In the literature, you're going to see that written as DOMS, D-O-M-S, but that is just the feeling of muscle soreness. And of course, delayed onset, usually that's how it goes. It's not, immediately after your exercise or training or whatever. It's just delayed onset muscle soreness. The next is just your ability to perform as a measure of recovery effectiveness. And the last one's going to be inflammation. So let's start with blood lactate and hydrogen ions. So this is something that most athletes have probably heard of, terms that many of you probably use. However, it's something that I think most people don't actually understand correctly. And I put myself in this boat until just probably a year and a half ago was when I finally listened to a lecture about what blood lactate and lactic acid actually is. And well, what happens is that we see an increase in lactate in the blood and in the muscle cell in conjunction with exercise. So it's reasonable to assume that exercise produces lactic acid, and that is what causes the feelings of soreness. However, it really is not the lactic acid itself or the lactate. Lactic acid and lactate are kind of the same thing, except an acid is able to donate a hydrogen ion, and then after that, we don't call it the acid, but we call it ate. It's called a conjugate base, so lactic acid, once it donates its hydrogen ion, becomes lactate, which is its conjugate base. However, it seems nowadays, the physiology of it all is that lactic acid actually serves as a sort of a buffer, which means that there are other substances in the blood, other acids that are stronger acids perhaps, that are going to be contributing to these hydrogen ions. The presence of hydrogen ions is what we consider acidity. That is where we get the term pH. It is the power of hydrogen ions. Anyways, lactate itself necessarily is not really what's causing the muscle fatigue, but rather it seems that lactate and lactic acid are actually kind of trying to go in and clear us of other acidotic chemicals and substances. It's trying to manage the acidity of the cell. So the reason I bring that up is because sometimes people will use, lactate, blood lactate levels, muscle lactate levels, kind of as a principle of how you have recovered. And so once all of the lactate has been flushed out of the muscle, then you must have recovered. And that's just not a great measurement for fatigue, because really we can't say that that is what causes our fatigue and our soreness post-exercise. And so if you wanted to kind of think of the blood lactate and things as sort of a physiological baseline, then that's okay. I think we can do that. And, maybe it's a sign that, if we've recovered and we're at a physiological baseline again, well, it must mean that we have recovered. I think that could be the case, but there's also been science and data to show that even if, your muscle fibers themselves haven't really recovered, you haven't refueled, you're not really going to be able to perform as well as you could. Your blood lactate levels are still going to kind of return to baseline anyway. So it really is just, it's not a reliable measure for how effective a recovery technique is, if that kind of makes sense to you. So for those reasons, I think it's more effective to use other forms of recovery metrics. The next one I said is DOMS, the delayed onset muscle soreness. And really this is kind of synonymous just with pain, with fatigue. Now, in the muscles themselves, of course, muscles are very innervated. That's how they contract. However, muscles themselves don't actually have the type of nerve fibers that signal to the brain feelings of pain. And so muscle cells themselves don't feel pain. So for example, when in exercise physiology labs, they do a muscle biopsy, they will use like lidocaine to numb the skin so that there's no pain sensation in the skin. However, they don't have to put, lidocaine or anything into the muscle itself because it's not going to feel the pain. And really, the muscle cells just kind of have this feeling of soreness or fatigue or tightness, usually in response to changing levels of fluid balance, usually like an increase in pressure, sort of a swelling or an edema. Post-exercise is very common, and that can be why we feel, sore. However, the muscle soreness then, for that reason, is also kind of not going to be a very great metric for recovery capability because it's not, some people think that their muscle soreness is that they're feeling all of the micro tears and the little bits of damage to their muscles that have occurred during exercise. And that's just not what muscle soreness means or indicates. And so if you are in pain and if you're experiencing muscle soreness, you're probably not going to be able to perform as well as you can, and therefore you're probably not recovered all the way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when there's no muscle soreness, you are recovered or things like that, because there's also, learned effects of muscle soreness. So for example, an elite athlete who's done an exercise very consistently for a long period of time, I'm sure many of you listening have experienced something like this. If you try a new exercise, or maybe it's just an exercise that's not new to you, but you haven't done it in a long time, sometimes you just get really, really, really sore after that workout. Whereas, again, like I said, an elite athlete who is more accustomed to this exercise, they might get the exact same, sort of adaptations to that exercise. I'm sure it could still be a very effective training session without them experiencing those same symptoms of muscle soreness. So does that mean that they're immediately recovered because they don't have muscle soreness? No. So I think that this muscle soreness is a component of recovery because it needs to be gone in a way for you to perform as best as you can. But again, it's not a great indicator of that muscle recovery. And so really what I think is the best indicator of, I have been using the term muscle recovery, but all sorts of recovery is just your ability to perform. Now, that might sound maybe like it's a little too easy, or maybe it's intuitive. I don't know how you feel about me using this metric. It's just my favorite for recovery. But to kind of go back to even the muscle soreness, sometimes even if you are still a little bit sore, you might feel bad. Your perception of your exertion during exercise is going to be higher. It's not going to feel great. However, a lot of times, especially in resistance and strength training, even if you're a little sore, you can actually still perform the same. Sometimes that little bit of muscle soreness doesn't actually impact your recovery at all. Whereas if, the damage done to the cells and they is recovered, there's no more damage lingering around to these muscle cells. They have adapted, they have grown, and they have been refueled. Like with all that, the recovery process, you can say with a reasonable bit of certainty, is over. Your body's done recovering when you can perform the same way you did in the previous bout. Now, again, that's not going to necessarily be a golden rule. There's always some sort of, genetic variations, and some people might just be able to, perform at the same caliber over and over and over and over again while still, kind of not having recovered all the way, and that can lead up to injury or extreme amounts of fatigue that will kind of, cascade down on them all at the same time. So you need to be careful, but I think in most cases, if you're doing more than you should, if you haven't recovered properly when you're trying to go to another training session, for the vast majority of people, if you're not recovered, you're not going to be able to perform as well. And so, in my opinion, simply, performance capability is the best metric for the effectiveness of a recovery technique. The last one to mention is that of inflammation. And we're actually going to talk about this at a couple different points in this episode, but I don't really like inflammation as a measure of muscle recovery. And again, I've been saying muscle recovery, but all different sorts of recovery, just because, I think it could be a very, very useful metric to look at, if somebody's inflammation has gone down kind of on its own, then that could be very valuable. However, the body's inflammatory response is very, very easy to modulate, whether that is, to things like extreme cold or, anti-inflammatory drugs. And so just because we've modulated that inflammation and cut it down doesn't mean that we've recovered just because of that. And so inflammation could be good if there's not, these external factors that are going to greatly impact it. However, just because of the possibility for it to be changed so much by things that don't necessarily cause recovery in the cells and in the tendons and in the resynthesis of like glycogen stores, I just don't love it as a marker for recovery. So throughout this episode, I am going to be considering performance capability as the best metric for recovery.